Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 102. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 9, and we're going to talk a little bit about gangs and drugs. Now, keep in mind this chapter is pretty long, so I'm going to kind of scale it back a little bit, and I'm going to try to stay within the 45 to 60 minute mark. But again, there's a lot of ground to cover, so would be one of those times where I would again tell you to make sure that you read through your textbook, look at the definitions that are on page 328, which will definitely help you understand some of the things that we're talking about as we kind of go through this. So this chapter begins with a discussion of the threat of gangs. We'll talk about some definitions of gangs, and I'll give you a couple. I'm also going to post a couple other videos or PowerPoints that are more specific to different gangs and deeper into the subculture. But for the purposes of tonight's lecture, we're just going to kind of brush the top of the chapter, if you will, but I'm going to need you to kind of read down in there. So again, keep that in mind. We're also going to look at the characteristics of gangs, a little bit of the subculture, how gang membership might be identified, and one of the most important pieces of this chapter is the reasons for joining a gang. We'll kind of take a look at that, and then we'll look at the importance of gang intelligence, and then finally we'll wrap it up with a link between gangs and drugs and provide some strategies and some other things. We'll get deeper into the terrorism aspect and the narcotics enforcement aspect in chapters later on in your textbook, but for tonight, again, it's just going to be kind of brushing the surface of some of the gang information here. So, when we talk about gangs, this phrase is always kind of synonymous. So drugs and gangs are often mentioned in the same sentence. The issues of gangs and drugs are both extremely important in today's law enforcement and to today's law enforcement practitioners, and dozens of publications are available that are out there. You can Google it and find a lot of different studies and good information that addresses each one of these topics individually and goes into greater detail. But again, just keep in mind where we're going tonight. So we'll talk about the threat of gangs to start off with, but by way of introduction, various types of gangs have been developed in the United States. There are very specific characteristics of gangs, a way that you could identify them and pick them out, including the gang subculture. And we are going to talk about IDing gang members and some of those things. No, but just keep in mind also that some of the things that we're going to talk about are just, again, some factors when you're looking at characteristics or identification. The mere fact that somebody wears a certain color does not make them a gang member. Now, when you put them in a certain neighborhood, a certain color, certain tattoos, hanging out with certain people, involved in certain crimes, could you be a little bit more focused and pretty much say, hey, this person probably is involved with gangs? Yes, you could. But again, I just don't want us to go out there and start saying, well, because they wear red, they're this, because they wear blue, they're that. That's not really how it is, but we will talk a little bit more in depth. And then we're going to look at, various drug control strategies that are being used in the war on drugs, ranging from incarceration to legalization, and a couple of hot topics right there, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So gangs have existed in nearly every civilization throughout recorded history. Street gangs started in our country in Los Angeles at about the beginning of the 20th century, and while the U.S. is currently experiencing an overall decline in crime rates, gang violence continues to plague some cities at very, very high levels. So we know that, and we see that with some of the data that we're getting, that while overall crime is down, in some cities violent crime is up, and in some cities that violent crime is being perpetuated by gang members. In your textbook on page 329, it talks about gang problems are most widespread in the nation's largest city, with nearly all law enforcement agencies serving cities with populations of 100,000 people or more reporting ongoing gang problems. Among agencies reporting a gang problem, approximately 37% characterized their gang problem as getting worse during 2010, and about 51% indicated that their gang problem was staying at about the same. To kind of go along with that, obtaining accurate estimates of gang membership can be a little bit challenging. According to the National Gang Center, about 756,000 gang members and about 29,000 gangs are estimated to have been active across the United States in 2010. Now, those numbers are up probably 3 or 4% from the previous year, but we'll look at another survey that cites a little bit, the numbers are a little bit higher. So a 2009 survey conducted by the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, regarding gang activity found that about 70% of responding jurisdictions, those being the departments that responded to the survey, had witnessed an increase in gang membership during the past 2 years, and 60% reported an increase in multi-jurisdictional gang-related crimes over that same period. More than 75%, however, of those responding cities cited that gang activity was one of the top factors contributing to violent crime in their communities. So that just kind of shows you a couple of different looks on some data and surveys that we're getting. Now, law enforcement respondents to another survey, so to the 2011 National Gang Threat Assessment Report, that most notable trends are the overall increase in gang membership, the expansion of criminal street gang control over street level drug sales, and the collaboration with rival gangs and other criminal organizations. So we saw some increase in those areas. This survey had a couple of highlights. Number one, gangs are responsible for an average of 48% of violent crime in most jurisdictions and up to 90% in several others. Number two, gangs are increasingly engaging in non-traditional gang-related crime, such as human trafficking and prostitution. Number three, many gang members continue to engage in activity while incarcerated, and we'll talk more about that later. And then the last one, but very, very defined, gang members are acquiring high-powered military-style weapons and equipment, which obviously poses a significant threat because of the potential to engage in lethal encounters with law enforcement and civilians. So we're starting to see some of these trends. As we continue to kind of look at some of the threat of gangs, we talk about Indian reservations. Gangs on Indian reservations oftentimes emulate those gangs that we know at the national level, so national level street gangs, and adopt names and identification from those recognized urban gangs. Gang members on some Indian reservations are also associating with gang members in the community to commit different crimes. And then finally, we see that gangs are becoming increasingly adaptable and sophisticated, also employing and using advanced technology to facilitate criminal activity discreetly, however, enhancing their criminal operations and connecting with other gang members. So look at social media for an example. Gang members are using different types of social media, just like you would on a daily basis, to kind of communicate what's going on in the gang world and maybe what the gang is going to be up to and things like that. So now we're going to move in quickly to defining gangs and classifying gangs. And again, I'm just going to kind of brush the surface here, but I definitely think that, or would implore you to read your textbook to make sure you can fill in some of the spots here. So an important problem in studying gangs is a lack of a common definition among local, state, and federal agencies, which may result in discrepancy between reported proliferation of gangs, meaning like, how many are there, what are the names, etc. For example, the National Alliance of Gang Investigators Association defines a gang as a group or association of 3 or more persons who may have a common identifying sign, symbol, or name, and who individually or collectively engage in or have engaged in criminal activity which creates an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. And it also talks about some crimes that they would have to engage in. Now, Title 18 USC Section 521, subsection A, subsection 1 defines a criminal street gang as an ongoing group, club, organization, or association of 5 or more individuals that has one of its primary purposes the commission of one or more criminal offenses. So, that is the definition, or a couple of different definitions of gangs. And if you look in there, there are a few other definitions that you can kind of take a look at. Additionally, law enforcement agencies tend to emphasize the same definitional characteristics in defining a gang, irrespective of the year of the gang onset. So these kinds of things include, in order of frequency of use, having a gang name, displaying colors, other symbols, hanging out together, claiming turf or territory. In identifying individual gang members, a clear majority of city and suburban agencies emphasize using self-nomination compared with using the criteria for identifying gangs. Rural communities might place greater emphasis on the display of tattoos, colors, or other symbols to designate gang membership. So that's just a little bit of information on that. Now, neighborhood-based street gangs exist throughout the country, and because of their sheer numbers and geographical coverage, really do pose the greatest threat. Although most gangs are typically limited to members of the same gender and are ethnically or racially homogeneous, comprising individuals who share the same language, cultural background, and frequency or heritage, we're starting to see more variations of that. So we're starting to see some mixing of gang members and from different cultures and from different backgrounds, and it's not quite as homogeneous as it was earlier on. Now, gang members that are in the prison system, that's a different story, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. One other thing to kind of add is the myth out there that most street gang members are juveniles. Well, there are a lot, and maybe we just don't identify juvenile the way that we should, but the reality is the average age for a gang member is right around 18 to 24. And the major ethnic or racial gang groups operating within the United States are kind of divided up into large groups, which would be like Hispanic, Latin American, African American, Asian, and white ethnic gangs. Now, there are several others, and smaller groups do exist, but for purposes of the text, we're just going to kind of touch on some of those. So when we look at Hispanic or Latin American gangs between 1910 and 1925, a large influx of immigrants arrived from Mexico. These immigrants tended to live with others from their native areas of Mexico, and subsequently rivalries developed that eventually resulted in the formation of groups or gangs. These Hispanic gangs lived in barrios that often could trace their heritage back several generations and had a very strong system of tradition. The Depression of the 1930s brought Latino families from Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas to LA, and again, they subsequently fragmented into groups, each claiming its own particular territory. Now, some that you might know, and again, that's not the whole history of the Hispanic or Latin American gangs, but we're just kind of, again, touching the surface of the textbook, and we'll get down deeper later on. A couple of gangs that you might recognize, 18th Street, Latin Kings, those are a couple larger of those gangs. Now, MS-13 is considered by many gang experts to be America's most dangerous gang, and investigations indicate it is present in almost every state, meaning the gang, continuing to grow its membership and targeting younger recruits more than ever before, and that is one way that they obviously recruit for the future, is out there targeting our youth. So that's why we need to come up with some prevention strategies, and that's something else we'll discuss towards the end of the chapter. African American gangs, well, those street gangs also existed in Los Angeles for many, many years, And the two large identifiers, while there are many, many sets and subsets and what have you, the Crips, basically a gang with the reputation of being the toughest African-American gang in Los Angeles, rivals to the Bloods. The Crips identify with what color? That would be blue. And of course, the Bloods, well-known African-American rivals of the Crips, and they identify with what color? Oh, that would be red. And right now, we're going to keep that kind of simple. So that way we can, again, we'll dive a little bit deeper. One thing about the Bloods, though, to remember, another group of African-American youth, and this is where they kind of started to formulate, who began to get together for protection from attacks by the Crips, applied the term Blood Brothers to their gang name, thus began the division of the African-American gangs into the Crips and the non-Crips, or Bloods. I'm going to post a couple of really, really good videos or links to videos that talk about the city of Compton, and that's where I was employed before I worked in the city of Rialto in law enforcement. I started my career in the city of Compton, and this is it's about an hour and a half long, maybe even 2 hours, and you can watch it at your leisure, but it's really going to show you how some of these gang members came to be, along with some success stories. So that's kind of what the show's about, but you'll see when I post it, and it's very, very intriguing. So moving on, because we have to kind of get through this, Asian gangs. The various Asian gangs in the United States consist of members of Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, and Filipino ethnicity, although historically limited to regions with large Asian populations. Asian gangs are currently expanding throughout communities nationwide. They are very highly structured organizations, but not quite as turf-based as, let's say, African-American or Hispanic street gangs. So a couple of names that you might, maybe have heard of or what have you would be like Tiny Rascals, Asian Boys, Crazy Brothers, Clan. Those are a couple of the Asian gangs. White or ethnic gangs are composed primarily of European American members, not necessarily, but for the most part. Neo-Nazi skinheads are perhaps the best known white ethnic gang, with members who are militantly racist and advocates of white supremacy, so Aryan Brotherhood, skinheads, and things like that. Females, although gangs and gang memberships remain on the whole predominantly male, that's really not the case anymore. We're starting to see a steady stream and presence of females. Now, early on, the females often assisted the male gang members, serving as decoys for rival gang members, lookouts during the commission of crimes, carriers of weapons when a gang war was going on. They may also carry information in and out of prison, harbor, or hide gang members from authorities. But we have also seen the fact that females are full-blown gang members, up to and including all female gangs. The last one, criminal gangs, as noted earlier, most agencies reported involvement in criminal activities as the most important factor in defining a gang. So keep that in mind. When you look down a little bit further in your textbook on pages 334, 335, 336, you're going to see the table titled Criminal Organizations. And it really is kind of interesting, where you can look at a little bit deeper into the gangs and what they do. So type of group, subtype, specific group, and distinct gangs, criminal activities, those are the categories, and it lists them all the way through. Not every single gang, but it'll give you a larger picture of some of the gangs that are out there. I know I'm going over this quick, but that's where I need you to kind of read. Outlaw motorcycle gangs are among the most dynamic gangs worldwide, even though the image of the biker gang member remains one of like leather and denim and rough and tumble, tough guy. The reality is that many of these members are well educated, some holding college-level degrees in finance, business, and law to basically improve the gang's proficiency. And a lot of times you'll see that motorcycle gangs are increasingly collaborating with organized crime. So murder for hire, drug sales, money laundering, things like that. Routinely and systematically will attempt to exploit and infiltrate law enforcement or other state agencies, meaning that they will try to get a job, let's say at DMV, where they have access to vehicle information or what have you. So that's the thought process, and approximately 44,000 members nationwide. Prison gangs. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but many of the country's most violent street gangs have their origins in the U.S. correctional system. Prison gangs are criminal organizations that originated within the penal system and operate within correctional facilities throughout the United States, although released members may be operating on the street. Prison gangs are also self-perpetuating criminal entities that can continue their criminal operations outside the confines of the penal system. So whether they're in or out, it really doesn't matter. If you're in, you can still run things. Prison gangs such as the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, and Aryan Brotherhood often have close ties to street gangs as well. Their leaders may serve as what we call shot callers for the street gangs, coordinating things like drug trafficking, extortion, intimidation, gambling, and other activities from prison. So within the prison walls, gangs engage in some of the same activities: drug trafficking, prostitution, and murder for hire. So the harsh reality is that, while we like to think that we in corrections or policing kind of run the jails and the prison system, sometimes the harsh reality is that the inmates or the cons run the jails, and the gangs basically rule the cons. So we do a great job in the correctional system, doing what we can, but that subculture that's within the correctional system dealing with gangs, you can kind of see how that goes, and there's a lot of good videos and programs that talk about prison gangs. So some characteristics, and we're going to have to kind of breeze through this really quickly so we can get through it. So the criteria used by various jurisdictions to define gangs previously discussed are collectively used to distinguish gangs from other groups. Distinguishing characteristics of gangs include criminal activity, the organization itself, the leadership, the use of symbols, and a name. So when we look at criminal activity, research indicates that most gang members already were committing crimes before they joined a gang, but their delinquency rates increased dramatically after joining the gang. Law enforcement data shows as much as 90% of the crime in some jurisdictions can be attributed to gang activity. So, and there's a couple other studies out there that talk about that. Organizations, although many gangs are loosely structured, some are quite formally organized. One common organizational element is age, with many gangs typically having 2 to 4 different kind of age groups. Another common organizational element is location. 2 or more gangs may have localized versions of the same, say, street gang name. For example, the Southside Warriors and the 10th Street Warriors. So the same, the Warriors part, but different locales or locations. And then, so one of the things to kind of look at here, give you a little bit of a metaphor on how the gang's leadership kind of is structured. So perhaps the most prevalent organizational feature is by membership, investment, or dedication to the gang. So if you take a gang's organization, you can visualize it somewhat like a bullseye. At the center are kind of the hardcore group members, a smaller group, let's just say 5 to 10%, for whom the gang, excuse me, is their family, their life, their entire world. Hardcore members have been in gangs the longest and frequently are in and out of jail, unemployed, involved in drugs, distribution or usage of drugs. The average age is early to mid-20s. However, some hardcore gang members could be older or younger. Hardcore members are very influential, and the leaders emerge from this group. So you kind of have that. Then as you look at that target and you go further out, in addition to hardcore members, most gangs have kind of like marginal membership, a much larger group of regular members from which hardcore members are recruited from. Those members are probably, let's say, average age 14 to 17 years old. They've already been initiated into the gang and tend to back up the hardcore gang members. If they stay in long enough, they could become hardcore later on. And then the outer ring of that gang organization consists of kind of, what they would call claimers, associates, or wannabes, those who aspire to become gang members, who might dress and talk like gang members and even write graffiti on, on the walls and things like that, but have really not yet been officially accepted or jumped in. So that's kind of the one way to look at the gang membership. Leadership, in some gangs, leadership is quite well defined and maybe one of three types: a key personality, chain of command type leadership, or collective. So, interesting, when you kind of look at that in the key personality leadership, one gang member, often older than the others from the ranks of the hardcore membership, is that strong leader. Another way, again, the chain of command. A gang with a chain of command is a form of leadership, functions kind of like a military unit or even a police department, which each group membership having a specific rank with a certain amount of authority from the top down. So it's kind of interesting. So if you look at a police department organizational chart, you have the chief at the top, and then say some captains and lieutenants and sergeants and officers. Well, that gang could actually be structured in the same way. And then finally, a gang with a collective leadership style has several different leaders, each of whom is called to lead based on specific kind of, whatever's going on. So based on circumstance. So enough on leadership. Domain identification. We're talking turf here. Okay. Typically, gangs stake out a geographic territory or turf as kind of their domain. It may be a specific place like a school, or it may be in a block, a half a block, a neighborhood. And typically, if another gang member kind of trespasses or infringes upon that other gang's turf, then there's likely for some type of violence. Symbols. Gang symbols are very common. Clothing, hand signals, graffitis, tattoos are all used as symbolic representation of a person's affiliation with a specific gang. So this is why, and it doesn't have it on here, but being able to communicate with gang members and talk to them and showing respect is one good way for you as a law enforcement individual to get that information that you need, that intelligence you need, but also being able to identify these symbols, looking at tattoos, looking at graffiti, looking at colors, all of those things, so you can really be understanding on whether or not you're being told the truth or things like that. Kind of continuing here, clothing can distinguish a particular gang. Sometimes colors are used to distinguish a gang. Gang members also use jerseys, t-shirts, hats, jackets with emblems. All of those are things that they will use or have on them or wear that really identifies kind of who they are and where they're from. Graffiti, very common form of symbolic communication used by gang members frequently to stake out their particular turf. Graffiti is sometimes referred to as the newspaper or the street, and it truly is, and makes what we know are public announcements of gang members and community residents basically advertising the exploits of the gang, or commemorating fallen gang members, or basically issuing challenges to other rival gangs. So, defacing, erasing, or substituting one gang's graffiti by a rival gang kind of constitutes a challenge, and also usually ends up in some type of violence or issue going on between the two gangs. So gang subculture. Taken together, the many characteristics of gangs just described form a gang subculture. These values, norms, lifestyles, or beliefs are often found in gang code of behavior, which may include the requirement to always wear your gang colors, or to get a tattoo to represent, or if arrested, not to be a snitch. Gang members will have monikers or street names that also help them, kind of entrench themselves into this gang subculture, if you will. So why now? So we've talked about some characteristics. Why do people join gangs? There's a lot of reasons. And some of them, a lot of us can sit back and we can say, well, I don't understand why people join gangs. And while, maybe you don't, look at some of the risk factors and some of the needs that these younger kids are looking for, and see, at least open your mind wide enough to understand that this is the reason that they join. So if we're going to come up with a strategy to keep kids out of gangs, we have to start looking at some of these factors. So the most common reasons for joining a gang are belonging, identity, recognition, protection, fellowship, brotherhood, or to make money. Because the drug trade, they're out there. You can make a lot of money doing that. Broken families, unemployment, poverty, and general despair can lead young people to seek economic opportunities frequently available through gang membership, because those economic opportunities might be running guns or selling drugs or being a lookout so you can make money. Try to convince a 14 or 13-year-old boy that lives in a, let's say, very low income neighborhood that has a high gang population in it, when he is walking around not only needing a level of protection because of the gang crimes that are taking place out there, but how about when that kid looks at somebody else on the corner that's got a fistful of $20 bills, gold chains, drives a car, has girls? How can you tell them or convince them that that's not okay? So again, I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying that if we're going to come up with strategies, these are things that we have to look at. So risk factors. Family structure is probably the most important risk factor in the formation of a gang member. Sometimes in those families there's a lacking of a male authority figure, or a negative role model. Where is that role model for that person growing up? And those are things that investigators have found certain common threads running through most families having hardcore gang members. The family is often a racial minority receiving some form of government assistance. And I'm not trying to be mean, I'm just giving you some data. The family often lacks a male authority figure. And again, just because one of these things might be present in somebody's household doesn't mean that those people won't be successful. But these are just some of the things that have been seen. So we talked about receiving government assistance, lacking a male authority figure, or the male figure may be a criminal themselves or a drug addict, therefore being what? A negative role model. Maybe the children in the home have minimal adult supervision, so they're out there just doing whatever they're doing. When one child first encounters law enforcement authorities, the dominant figure, usually the mother, makes excuses for the child, often accusing society. Thus, children are kind of taught early on that they're not responsible for their actions and are shown how to transfer blame to society. So it's the old kind of, hey, this is our neighborhood, this is what we're up against, and it's everybody else's fault. That's not necessarily the case. Can economics cause problems for families? Absolutely. Okay, but that doesn't mean that people can't still, maintain their values and what have you, and do the right things. A second common family structure is one with two strong family members in a mother and father, usually graduates from gangs themselves. They see little wrong with their children belonging to a gang. So it's homegrown. Mom was a gang member, dad was a gang member, uncle was a gang member, so it's kind of like an assembly line of gang members, therefore it's okay. Another common family structure issue is one where the parents are non-English speaking immigrants. The children tend to adapt rapidly to the American way of life, and in doing so lose respect for their parents and the old ways. They become experts at, let's say, manipulating their parents, and the parents lose control over their kids. So sometimes that is one thing that happens. So how do we get a handle on all this stuff? We in law enforcement, or those aspiring to get into law enforcement, or even if you're going to work in probation, parole, the prison system, counseling, anything. This is probably the number one important piece here of this chapter, and it's going to be titled Gang Intelligence. In the war against gang, information and intelligence, they're not only vital, they're key. Common sources of information on gangs include internal contacts with patrol officers, detectives, internal departmental records, computerized files, review of crime reports and offense reports. Most important, though, interviews with gang members, information from other local police agencies, surveillance activities, and use of paid or unpaid informants. Information may also be obtained from other criminal justice agencies or other state and federal agencies, schools, or undercover assignments. All of this information really helps us deal with this big gang intelligence cycle. So these are all things that we really need to have in order to fight the war on gangs, because intelligence is really going to start to drive some of the things that we do. Some of the gang control strategies, and we're not going to talk a lot about them, but the approaches would be, let's say, targeting hotspots. So those areas where all these gang crimes are happening, saturation patrols, just saturating certain areas with foot patrols, bike patrol, gang sweeps, and things like that. The Department of Justice has a dual approach, basically suppression and prevention, because just going in there and arresting everybody isn't always the best thing. It might be a way in which your agency can get in and start to clean up some of the things in there, but you have to have an active prevention program as well. So throughout the country, several approaches to addressing the gang problem have been used. These include primary prevention, secondary prevention, intervention, suppression, and reentry. Now, the reentry point, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is very, very important, and I'm going to get to it in a second. So primary prevention targets the entire population in high crime, high risk communities. The key component here is a one-stop resource center that makes services accessible and visible to community members. Secondary prevention identifies young children, let's say ages 7 to 14, at high risk, and drawing upon resources of schools, community-based organizations, faith-based groups, intervenes with appropriate resources and services before early problem behaviors turn into serious delinquency and gang involvement. Intervention targets active gang members, close associates, and gang members returning from confinement, and involves aggressive outreach and recruitment activities. Intervention helps gang members who want to get out of the gang and help themselves immediately. Suppression focuses directly on identifying the most dangerous and influential gang members and basically removing them from the community in a lawful means. And finally, reentry. Okay, a big thing now. Targets serious offenders returning to the community after confinement and provides appropriate services and monitoring. Now, if you read a little bit further down on page 345, it talks about a PERF survey and shows information from respondents reporting that their agency has used the following strategies, tactics, and activities to combat gang violence. You can look at that on your own, but the reentry program, you're starting to see a lot of organizations with these community reentry programs because of the fact that a lot of people are getting out of the prison system now, that we're trying to figure out a better way to provide services to these folks to get them back up on their feet, get them jobs, get them out there, and become productive members of society. So these are things that we're really working on quite a bit. So a comprehensive strategy, you can look here at the OJJDP comprehensive gang model, talks about community mobilization, a provision for opportunities, social intervention, suppression, and then organizational change and development. I'm going to let you look a little bit more at that yourself, but I will say that currently the most commonly used strategies to combat gang problems are targeting gang hotspots, followed by targeting known gang offenders, use of informants, school resource officers, saturation patrol, and of targeted gang areas. The most effective strategies to combat gang violence were saturation patrols, targeting hotspots, identifying, tracking, targeting known gang members, zero tolerance initiatives, partnerships, and multi-agency initiatives using task forces and prosecution efforts. So that's just a couple of bits of information. It's on page 346 and 347 in your textbook if you need to read a little bit further. So when it comes to prosecuting gang members, there's a little bit of a problem in dealing with that as well, because you have to understand that law enforcement is the first component of the criminal justice system that responds to the gang problem. Officers, along with prosecutors, have great discretionary power when dealing with gang members. Prosecution of gang members or gang-related crimes is often made very difficult because victims and witnesses are very reluctant to cooperate. One reason for that reluctance is a sense of futility in trying to rid an area of all gang activity. Local residents may be hesitant to get involved and risk personal harm in an effort to put one gang away when they know that another gang is basically poised to kind of move right in. So, there's that aspect. There's the intimidation. Some people or witnesses are reluctant because of gang intimidation and fear of reprisal, meaning that people are going to retaliate on them. Some other obstacles to prosecution include uncertain victim and witness credibility, sometimes inadequacy in police reports, and a lack of appropriate information that you have. So a lot of these different things are there that sometimes hinder prosecuting of gang members. When you talk about gangs, drugs, crime, and violence, you can look at how close-knit these are. So closely related to the gang problem is the drug problem, because many gang members are involved in the use or sale of illicit drugs. Many gang members can be classified, or many gangs can be classified as kind of like drug gangs, meaning that's what they do. So in your textbook, you look at page 354 and even page 355, you can see some of the rationales for prosecuting gang cases and why they can't sometimes prosecute them, because it is tough to do that. Moving on a little bit, because we're going to have to kind of really get moving here. Drug cartels. So we talk about gangs. We always have to talk a little bit about drugs. Drug cartels, sharing many of the same characteristics of gangs, are criminal organizations that promote and control drug trafficking operations. Cartels range from informal agreements among various drug traffickers to very formalized commercial enterprises or businesses. Drug cartels operate in many countries throughout Latin America, with some of the more notorious coming from Colombia and Mexico. Afghanistan and some countries in South Asia have also produced drug cartels. Currently, however, the biggest threat is still coming from Mexico. According to the National Drug Threat Assessment Report in 2011, the greatest organized crime threat to the United States currently comes from Mexican drug trafficking organizations, alternately referred to as Mexican transactional criminal organizations. So you can see where some of this is coming from. Now, these organizations are deeply involved in crimes like bribery, kidnapping, and other crimes of violence. A lot of these different cartels are involved in home invasion robberies that are committed by drug cartel members. Now, Phoenix right now currently leads the nations in kidnappings, home invasions, and these are just two crimes frequently committed by drug cartel members. Talk about U.S. borders. Although the primary gateway for illegal drug entry into the United States is the southwest border, drugs can and do enter the country through air and seaports, as well as along the highly vulnerable, vast, and often unpopulated Canadian-American borders. So, it's not just coming from, from Mexico. We're starting to see other border entry points that are really causing us problems. So, staying on the drug discussion for just a second, American history is filled with drug use, including alcohol and tobacco. As the early settlers moved west, one of the first buildings in each frontier town, if you can think about it, was a saloon. Cocaine was also common by about the 1880s. At the beginning of the 20th century, cocaine was the drug of choice, said to cure everything from indigestion to toothaches. Imagine that. It was added to flavor soft drinks such as Coca-Cola, if you didn't know that. In 1909, a presidential commission reported to President Theodore Roosevelt that cocaine was a hazard, leading to loss of livelihood and lives. As the public became increasingly aware of these hazards posed by cocaine and other drugs, it pressed for legislation against these types of drugs. In 1914, the federal government passed the Harrison Narcotics Act, which made the sale or use of certain drugs illegal. So, when you look at the National Drug Threat Assessment, you can look at cocaine, heroin, marijuana, methamphetamine, MDMA, or ecstasy. A lot of these different things are very problematic in society, and I'm not going to go through all the abuse issues. Now, one thing to note with marijuana, and we'll talk about it in a little bit chapter, would be the possibility of legalization. So, stay tuned for more information on that. I wouldn't be surprised that in the November 2016 election that there won't be something else on the ballots in California on the legalization of recreational marijuana use. And I'll give you my 2 cents on that. Absolutely not, I hope. But anyway, more to follow on that. So, controlled substances, kind of a little bit of an overview. The Controlled Substances Act, or CSA, of 1984 placed all federally regulated substances into one of 5 schedules based on the substance's effects, medical use, potential for abuse, and safety or dependency liability. So what that means is drugs in Schedule 1 have the highest potential for abuse, unpredictable effects, and no generally accepted medical use. Schedule 1 drugs include things like heroin, LSD, GHB, marijuana. At the other end of the scale, Schedule 5 drugs have the lowest potential for abuse, may lead to limited physical or psychological dependence, and have many accepted medical uses. So I'm not going to go through all of those on here. I would like you to kind of read through some of these and take a peek. Cocaine is just very quickly, and we're going to have a separate chapter on this, but again, I'll give you a couple of things. Cocaine is a central nervous system stimulant narcotic derived from the South American coca bush. Cocaine may be inhaled or injected, and there's a lot of different ways that they're doing it now. Cocaine smuggling is big business, run primarily by Colombians. They are often assisted by tourists and students and anybody else that wants to help mule illicit drugs across the borders. And that's what a mule is, an individual who smuggles cocaine or other drugs across the borders to basically get it into our communities. Crack is a form of cocaine that has been called the equal opportunity drug because it's low cost. So, when you look at the difference between, like, say, pure powder cocaine and crack cocaine, the cost is significantly different, but the ability for abuse or the possibility of abusing that drug, crack is very, very high. Heroin is a central nervous system depressant that relieves pain and induces sleep. Most heroin originates from the opium poppy farms of Southwest Asia. The opium gum, basically from the plant, is converted to morphine in labs near the fields, and then subsequently to heroin in labs within near producing countries. So after importation, drug dealers cut or dilute the heroin before selling it to addicts. Marijuana, we know, is the most available and abused illicit drug in the United States. And the marijuana laws are basically changing a little bit. So again, stay tuned for a little bit on that. Methamphetamine, or meth, is known as speed ice crystal, and like cocaine is a potent central nervous system stimulant. Methamphetamine is second only to alcohol and marijuana as the drug most frequently used in some Western and Midwestern states. More than 50% of country law enforcement agencies surveyed in 2006 listed methamphetamine as the #1 drug problem in their particular area. So a little bit on that. And then finally, MDMA, perhaps the most prolific club drug out there attracting law enforcement attention, is MDMA, also called ecstasy. So it's in tablet form, typically, almost always taken orally, although it can be snorted, dissolved in water, or injected. So now that we kind of know a little bit, I want to give you really quick one myth too. So there's a lot of common effects that are out there that stem from the use of various controlled substances. So, they can be mind altering. They can obviously become addicting, either physically or psychologically. And the overdose of these may result in convulsions, other medical problems, and death. A myth that's out there, though, is that prescription drugs are much safer than some of the illicit drugs. That's really a myth. Many prescription medications are actually very powerful drugs that require proper dosing and monitoring by somebody that's trained and licensed to do so. So a lot of times people can become addicted to prescription drugs. Not only that, they can be addicted to over-the-counter drugs. So something like drinking cough syrup, in order to get high. Those are things that people could be doing out there. So moving on now real quick, because we only have a few more minutes, the war on drugs, the National Drug Control Strategy. So how do we deal with this? Well, in 1973, President Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs. Since that time, federal spending on the war of drugs and the war against drug smugglers, users, and sellers has increased probably 30 times, from $420 million in 1973 to like $12.7 billion in 2004. Drug arrests have nearly tripled since 1980, when the federal drug policy shifted to arresting and incarcerating users. Now, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, a component of the Executive Office of the President, was established by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 and released an annual report called the National Drug Control Strategy, outlining the administration's plan for reducing drug use and its consequences. So just to touch on it quick, it talked about stopping drugs before it starts, heal America's drug users, so treatment and things like that, and then disrupting the market. So those were the core strategies of that report. So, and sometimes a lot easier said than done. So looking at the slide here that we have on the screen, Stop Drugs Before It Starts, there was a program called DARE. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing behind DARE, but the Drug Abuse Resistance and Education Program was developed in Los Angeles in 1983 and had, at that time, become one of the most well-known and widespread crime prevention programs in the country. The program trained hundreds and thousands of police officers and educated millions of kids. spreading to 43 different countries. Now, the DARE program came under quite a bit of criticism at the beginning of the 21st century, with many researchers claiming that the program didn't work. Well, since then, it has been retooled and rewritten and revised, and I'm going to let you read a little bit more about that. Healing America's drug users, we talked about that. Critics of the government's approach to the drug war believe that the focus should be shifted to funding drug treatment programs rather than spending billions of dollars attacking the drug users and dealers. To address alcohol and drug problems, treatment services should, 1, be based on formal theories in drug dependence and abuse, 2, use the best therapeutic tools available, and 3, give participants opportunities to build cognitive skills. So the question here, is it better do we arrest the users and prosecute them and get them into the system, or is prevention and treatment and healing really the best approach, or is it possibly a combination of both? So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Disrupting the market is kind of just what it says: local, national, international. So things like drug raids, using surveillance to undercover assignments, to arresting the drug dealers, and that's really what it is when it comes to disrupting the market. Now, taking money is obviously going to hit the drug dealers right at the heart of their particular gang or group, because if you can get their money, because that's really what they're out for. On page 370, your book talks about drug control strategies, both punishment and legalization, crime control, rehab, and prevention. And there's a chart that you can kind of walk through there. So again, I asked the question here as we're finishing up: is punishment the answer? Again, one way to handle the drug problem is to punish those involved in selling or using illicit drugs, either through incarceration or asset forfeiture, in hopes that such sanctions will deter future criminal behavior. So is punishment the answer? So is spending time behind bars, is that really the answer? Now, the asset forfeiture key that I talked about is that there are laws on the books to where if you seize money during a drug case, you can basically seize the money that you recovered from that case, and you can run it through what they call the asset forfeiture system. It was introduced in the United States through the passage of the RICO Act in 1970, to where you can take their money. So, or moving a little bit further now, and to kind of generate a little bit of conversation, although I'm the only one talking, is legalization of some of this the answer? Legalization of drugs has been a topic of debate in the United States since the passage of the Harrison Act in 1914. Some advocates making marijuana and other drugs legal, just as alcohol, they're claiming that this would reduce the cost of maintaining a drug habit and consequently reduce the amount of crime committed in order to obtain money to support that habit. But is that really a fair way of doing it? Hey, make it legal and then they won't steal or rob to do it. So some arguments for legalizing some of this stuff. Proponents of drug legalization kind of give these following arguments. Well, costs. Dollars now spent on enforcement could be used for education and treatment. Organized crime. Legalization would eliminate the drug lord's major source of funds. I don't know. And revenues. Taxing drugs, like taxes on alcohol and tobacco, could be used to finance treatment programs. Well, is that really the answer? Some of the arguments against. So those that oppose. Increased drug use and addiction. Inexpensive, widely available drugs would increase addiction. Increased crime, because of the proven link between drug use and crime, more drug users or addicts would lead to increased levels of crime. So interesting. Medical costs. Health costs of drug abuse would increase. Social values. Legalizing drugs would make them socially acceptable. And then think about this. What about those careers out there, those jobs to where you shouldn't be smoking marijuana and then going to work? I mean, you shouldn't be doing it anyway. That's just my opinion, of course, and that's mine alone. But I'm saying that there's that. And then there are studies and things where they talk about the nexus of, um, illicit drug abuse and crime. So the relationship between illicit drugs and crime is very complex. And 4 lessons from history and economics provide insight regarding the limitations of criminal law in controlling products or services that a large number of people want. Now, this is discussed more in depth on page 375. But, some lessons. Someone's going to try to supply it. Suppression will result in massive evasion. Well, maybe not. Enforcement efforts will generate secondary crime. Enforcement efforts encourage adaptations, drug-defined offenses, drug-related offenses. So all of these different things are out there when it talks about the nexus between the two. So wrapping up, because we're there, a major threat facing our nation's society is gangs. Family structure is probably the most important risk factor in the formation of a gang member. Drug use and abuse poses serious threats to our nation. Marijuana is the most available and abused illegal drug in the United States. Stay tuned for more on that. And the core components of the National Drug Control Strategy are prevention, treatment, and law enforcement efforts. So that's going to be it for this particular chapter, Chapter 9. And we will talk more again next week. So until then, we'll talk to you soon. Don't forget, if you have any questions, post it on the general discussion board.